Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar where we will discuss how every event matters in cybersecurity. My name is Randy Watkins. I'm the Chief Technology Officer for Critical Start. And today I have the pleasure of being joined by Craig Robinson, the Program Director of Security Services for IDC. Craig, thanks for joining.
Hey, good to be here.
Hey, before we dive into this discussion, why don't we start with a little bit of your background and tell us what you do at IDC?
Cool. Well, I'm what you might consider a recovering practitioner. Uh, Lifelong time spent in terms of technology and security out in the real world. And now I've flipped over. I took the red pill, you might say, and I've joined the analyst firm IDC, so I can start talking about things like cyber resilience and managed detection and response and threat intelligence and those sorts of things that listeners to today's webinar were probably interested in.
Excellent. Very good. So collecting information from the security community at large, combining it with your observations from the security market, making recommendations for customers on how to best adapt their cybersecurity program to face today's threats.
Yep, it's the perfect job for someone with ADD.
Excellent. Well, let's dive into our topic a little bit and go over our agenda. So we knocked out the introductions. We're going to go through some security models, but really the focus for the conversation is how the digital transformation has changed our attack surface and what organizations can do to deal with the kind of increased attacks and also the publicity behind the attacks. So let's start by talking about digital transformation. And the whole technology first mindset. How do you define digital transformation?
Oh, wow. For some firms, they might consider digital transformation as I've moved my apps from on-premise to cloud. And unfortunately, that occurs sometimes and without properly re-engineering them. If you're just moving a relatively secure app on-prem to a cloud premise without making the appropriate changes, you're not really that secure. But that's one definition, moving to the cloud. Others is just that pure reliance, in terms of technology. And, the whole idea behind this digital transformations is how do we smooth operations? How do we make things easier to interact, in a digital way with our customers in order to give them the information, the goods and the services that they need. Cybersecurity, we try to help them to do that in a secure and safe mindset.
Yeah, and when you look at how organizations are kind of evolving, it kind of doesn't matter which industry you're in anymore. You are a digital company, and we see even industrial organizations starting to pivot towards application development. They're writing their own code so they can make their new parts or control their own CNC machines. Even the most seemingly primitive verticals are becoming kind of high-tech industries, and that's having a pretty massive impact on the attack surface, right? These organizations that have never leveraged technology before now have full-blown applications with pretty little in the way of security baked into them.
Oh, absolutely. It's funny. I just watched a TikTok video that someone sent me the other day, or at least was posted online, and he was sitting in a sushi restaurant, and I have a background in terms of IT with sushi restaurants, and it was this robot that just brought them their food. It knew exactly where to go, and it positioned itself, if I read it right, in terms of which person should be getting which dish or which role appropriately. And it's like, that's the sort of things when we start talking about the labor shortage and how robotics and other automation pieces are trying to make our society still function. We really are in a digitally transformed world.
Yeah, I think the initial definition of digital transformation was exactly what you mentioned. Like, hey, we're moving to the cloud, and that's great. But the true digital transformation comes in the actual use of electronics and technology, where previously there was no technology. And like you said, they're really trying to automate operations, increase efficiencies, and in some cases develop new products or new lines of business. And that's great, right? We love to see adoption of technology, but unfortunately, it's led to a lot of downstream implications that maybe weren't considered heading into it, like security. Security is often a bolt-on after the fact, and I think we've seen with some of the news headlines recently that I mean, these O days, these third party attacks are are becoming more and more prevalent, but also more and more damaging because of this digital transformation. What do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And then start thinking about it's no longer just the making sure what you've developed in your house is secure. But for example, when you start talking about Log4Shell, it's like, okay, what sort of open source components is the software that we're using for our internal applications, or to make it more scary and expand the risk out, how does that impact our third party suppliers? Can I trust that the supplier of my widgets that I use to manufacture my connected car is resilient to any attacks that come across their way? So our the the universe that we need to look at in terms of what's secure has grown from not only just the four walls that we used to think about pre-pandemic. It's shifted to the cloud. Yep, we have to make sure that our applications and everything we use in the cloud are secure, but now we need to make sure our supply chain is secure. And is the provider of our security or technology services, are the applications that they use to help me in my operations, is that secure? How often do I go and assess it? How do I go about making sure that I got people that can help me to make sure that my environment and my stakeholders are secure? It's job security for us, Randy, because it keeps us busy, right?
But unfortunately, it does bring down some of the services that we may depend on. And if you do a quick Google search, you see how prominent these things are becoming. And for IT security folks that, I mean, we've been in it for a while, we're looking around saying, hey guys, O days and third party attacks are nothing new. But the big difference is two things. One, we used to have this inherent trust of third parties, where when we brought them into the environment, an attack on them was an attack on them, not an attack on our organization. I think that's quickly dissolved. And then the other thing is the media's actual coverage in it and how much attention they're giving to O days and third party attacks and just cyber in general. It seems like you can't turn on the news without hearing about another breach, which is both good and bad. It really brings a lot of attention to it from a board and a C-suite perspective. But how are organizations expected to shift and secure some of these third party apps that they may not have any control over the code delivery of?
Oh, I think things like, software bill of materials is going to become more and more apparent. Understanding what makes up the DNA of the apps and the software that are produced in-house or consumed from others is apparent. The other key point to keep in mind is all this stuff is really hard. If it was really easy, we'd be paying minimum wage to all these people that are trying to figure out, but it's hard. So sometimes you need to go off and get those experts that can make sure that what you're using, consuming, and producing is secure, and to be able to do that sweep across the horizon, because what was secure yesterday may not be secure today, depending upon how quickly some of these attacks come out.
Yeah, that's a trend, right? I mean, and it comes in ebbs and flows, it seems, just depending on where the marketing of security takes you. But there's always a prevention, a strong prevention standpoint, a strong prevention posture. But really, we need to get back to the mindset, and I say back to it because we kind of ebb and flow in and out of this mindset of it's not if, it's when, right? Especially with all the new vectors, you have to anticipate breach and have your response procedures ready to move and act on. And
Yeah.
we just don't see that from many organizations, especially when you consider some of these nuanced kind of edge attack cases that are no longer nuanced or edge.
Yeah. And when you start looking at some of the industries as well, I was just having a discussion, with my sister, who works in a hospital, and the recent Chronos issues in terms of not being able to just do something as simple as clock in and clock out. It's hard to train well-trained, smart people like doctors how to do things like write down on a piece of paper, what they're doing, where their ins and outs. I think cyber resilience, while it garnered some more attention as of late, should really be paramount right now. We need to be able to function with the minimal viable infrastructure. That's a new acronym, MVI. So, as an analyst, we have to create and utilize the acronym names, Randy, as you know.
You got to hit your
But we
quota.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I think I'm getting close. I'll think of another one along the way. But we have to be able to do our jobs when the tools and technologies that rely upon doing these jobs isn't available at times. You certainly want to minimize that, but just being cyber resilient, is going to become more and more paramount and more of a discussion item, I think, as boards and C-suites start recognizing how much they rely upon technology. That's great. That's going to help. We need that, but they also need to invest in securing that, and they also need to be able to get their people set up to be resilient to any of these attacks that come across.
Well, let's define resilience. So, I mean, we use the word a lot. To IDC, what does resilience mean?
Yeah, the latest thinking along that lines is it's really dusting off those business continuity models that you had from the 80s and the 90s, maybe early 2000s. Add on the disaster recovery that we started adding on in the 2000s and 2010s. And then you need to have a cyber recovery capability as well. So recovering from a cyber attack is different than recovering than, say, a fire that takes out your data center, or an outage in Active Directory within Azure that brings down a data center, and all of a sudden no one can use the apps that they rely upon. So it's not necessarily technology specific. It involves talking to people, business processes, understanding what's the most important crown jewels that you need to be safe and secure and bring back up in case of utter break the glass, call Batman and Robin out to save you from the cyber attack, or call you, Randy. And then being able to recover in a timely manner. That to me is cyber resilience.
Yeah, and I agree with that definition, and the reason why I preach cyber resilience instead of a prevent only standpoint is because resilience does assume breach, right?
Yeah.
Resilience assumes breach, and then it accommodates for the steps that come after breach, which is exactly what you said, recovery. Right.
Yeah.
So it's not just prevention, but it's also the detection and response to mitigate the threat or mitigate the impact of the threat. And I do see business executives starting to ask, okay, so what happens when we do get breached? And I think that's the right question. A lot of folks are looking towards their insurance providers or cyber insurance providers, seeing the 500% increase in premium and saying, okay, well, maybe I go back to the drawing board and figure out how to do some more of this in-house to prevent the need for an insurance policy in the first place.
Yeah, and having that preparedness mindset, I'd much rather see cyber insurance policies paying for the cyber recovery from an air-gapped, monitored backup solution as needed, rather than paying cyber criminals to be able to continue doing the vicious attacks that they do. So I think that's part of being cyber resilient, which really kind of also ties into zero trust to a certain extent. You talked about the assumed breach. When the board asks, what are you going to do in case you're breached? What does zero trust do? Zero trust has that assume you're breached mindset. So what is the next acronym of the day? So, and I've hit my quota, ZTNA, zero trust network architecture. Having that in place is going to help to reduce the spread of any lateral movement, as well as detect attacks quicker.
Yeah, and zero trust is something that we use inside of our own kind of messaging when we talk about how we do alert analysis. So I think the big myth about zero trust is it is a technology that you can buy. It's a capability that you can just bolt on, but it's actually a way of thinking. And what it really is a positive security model where you're only allowing known good behavior, and then you're essentially questioning everything that you're not expecting, or you're assuming that it's bad if it's unknown. We take that approach with alerts. How are security leaders trying to push this through with businesses being somewhat resilient to implement some of these more potentially disruptive controls?
Yeah, it's hard, and my advice would be, do the easy thing first. Demonstrate your competency, in terms of, for example, doing a zero trust. Maybe it's segmenting off part of your network. Demonstrate that the lights still turn on. Bad guys are able to stay out of that area, things still function, and then take that pilot approach and then start expanding it. But you nailed it. Zero trust isn't a project, it's a way of life. It's a thinking about that. That would be my advice for what it's worth.
And now we do actually have quite a few products on the market through the breach and attack simulation rise that allow you to validate those security controls at your different segmentation points. I've seen a little bit of an adoption of the breach and attack simulation space for that. What are you seeing out in the market in terms of customers implementing and validating these security controls?
Yeah, there's a lot more interest in that, and I think part of that is that recognition that doing quarterly or weekly vulnerability scans, or maybe doing that annual pen test, that you can check off the box on PCI and say you did that, but just because you're compliant doesn't mean you're secure, and too often people kind of have that understanding. So, speed and automation are two key things to put in a cybersecurity practitioner's tool chest. Having something like a breach and attack simulation capability that allows you to, test the efficacy of your controls. A lot of it is, as you can probably attest to, Randy, is just, a lot of times these issues are just misconfigurations. Or is multi-factor turned on everywhere? Interesting note of news: Salesforce just announced, I think it was yesterday, and we're recording this, on the 13th, I think, of January, for people that listen to it in the future, announced that multi-factor is going to be required for Salesforce. It's like, wow, that's great, but here's the sad news: it probably should have been done a while ago.
Right. Welcome to 2018.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm not beating up Salesforce, because you could probably pull out your good old-fashioned Rolodex and look at the number of companies that don't have minimal security like that. But that's the sort of things that we need to do, is to be able to turn on multi-factor authentication, do those minimal things, start building up your security program layer by layer in order to get yourself to where you become that magic term, cyber resilient.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I mean, a lot of organizations, I feel, are chasing kind of some pie in the sky security controls, and they haven't implemented the low hanging fruit. They haven't put in the foundational necessities like multi-factor authentication, or looking at their permissions and trying to move back to a least privilege model. And it's weird, because we're starting to see some business owners raise security controls and get more familiar with cybersecurity because they recognize the need for it. And we're also seeing some security leadership really step up to understand the business. The most effective CISOs usually do, but there still seems to be a lack of business sense coming out of security. Where do you see that disconnect really playing a role?
There's this classic persona that we think of cybersecurity professionals, with their roots in IT, just being those super nerdy, guys and gals that go off there and wage war in cybersecurity, and all they do is PowerShell or Python all day, and fight the bad guys with these scripts and tune in their IDS systems. But to be honest, it's a business discussion. It's an organizational discussion. It's a training discussion, that needs to go along in the business. So what's really important is that cybersecurity practitioners demonstrate their competence, be transparent and be engaged. HR people, for anyone that's listening on this discussion from that perspective, future cybersecurity leaders need to be able to communicate, and they need to be able to understand the industry that they're operating within. You need to understand that if you're in the medical industry, that the New York Department of Financial Services, believe it or not, is largely a medical industry, regulatory body that applies to that. It's not just HIPAA that you have to look at. PCI, it applies to retail, but there's regional organizational compliance bodies you need to take a look at. Look at GDPR, look at every other state coming up with a new regulation around privacy or where data can reside. So if someone's just looking at, for example, when we were doing that really cool animation, so kudos to your internal marketing team there, Randy. But that's you, Emily, for throwing that up there. But really, we need to be taking a look at business issues and then correlate that with how do we keep these business issues secure with our security knowledge that us cybersecurity practitioners keep locked up in our heads.
Yeah, I've had the pleasure of working with quite a few CISOs that did understand the business. They understood how the business made money and how cyber impacted the business's ability to continue with their operations. And those are the ones that usually have the best communication skills and also get the most budget, right? Because they can justify exactly why they're asking for what they're asking for. So we
Mhm.
looked inside of our survey at, what are the top things that get brought up in the board. And what came up was, the kind of top three are ones we'd expect: productivity loss, so the business goes down; cyber insurance, we just talked about this, like soaring premiums from that; and regulatory fines, followed very
Mhm.
closely by ransomware and managed services. Now, the top ones are all kind of attacks and losses from the attacks. The fifth one is the only one that's preventative, and it's markedly lower than the actual attacks themselves. So it seems
Yeah,
like boards are definitely more focused on the outcomes of these cyber incidents rather than how do you prevent them in the first place.
right. And preventing them is some of the ones on the bottom,
Exactly. Yeah,
you know?
training, internal staffing, security consulting. I mean, these are the ones that the board's not asking about. So they're
Yeah.
saying, "Hey, what do we do about these threats? We just pay for it. How much is that going to cost me?"
Yep.
They're not looking at the preventative control. So how can security leaders help bridge that gap for the businesses to understand that there's more to prevention, detection, response, and resiliency than just having the policy or paying the fine.
I think some of that is we've been so busy dealing with the day-to-day SOC functions like detecting attacks, responding to attacks, threat intelligence. We get so caught up in that we lose sight of the fact that we're dealing with organizations or businesses that rely upon our knowledge to help them to grow and further their organizational goals. If you're so busy trying to figure out, what tickets are in your ServiceNow desk, from your MDR provider or your internal team, then odds are you're not able to work on something that is low cost but high efficiency, like training. You know, so we need to figure out a way, and I think the industry is starting to figure it out. But we need to be able to lessen the amount of time spent on detection and response and spend more time on those proactive services, those proactive capabilities that have a longer time frame in terms of being able to help the organization on their strategic journeys.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting that 32% say that managed security services are a board issue, but then internal staffing is only 22%. So
Yeah.
clearly the board is looking at how can we get more efficient security, and
Hmm.
how can we get rid of maybe some of the blocking and tackling, and really elevate those resources to some of the things you're talking about. What are we doing around vulnerability management, patching, identity and access management, the things that take boots on ground, that take knowledge of the business to properly implement? How do
Hmm.
we repurpose those blocking and tackling tier 1 and 2 resources and really elevate them to a position of leadership where they can make up for some of this massive talent shortage that organizations are facing?
Yeah. And it's funny you bring up identity access management. And that's so important. But when's the last time you took a look at your SAP uh, roles, that you allow people to have access to? When's the last time you looked at your Salesforce credentials and what they can look at, or your own internal data lakes, that people have access to? Those are the sorts of things that we need to start pointing our security practitioners into the business. And as they provide value in that area, as they provide some guidance in that area, they're going to garner more respect they're going to garner more trust. And I think that's a win-win for everyone, because not only does security need to become more part of the DNA of organizations, but the business goals and strategic direction of organizations needs to be ingrained within the security practitioners, so that they understand what are the crown jewels that need to be protected, what's most important for them to be taking a look at.
Yeah, 100%. We've definitely kind of seen the shift over the last 7 or 8 years or so to security enabling business. I remember that was the big push of like 2016, 17, 18 was security is enabling business, because they really understood my job is not to be the police. My job is to protect this business functioning and continuing to generate revenue. And once that kind of business logic clicked in security's head of, we're no longer yes or no, we're just kind of doing the will of the company and protecting what we can, then I think it really became an alignment between business and security that has kind of forged some of the relationship that we have today between the C-suite, the board, and the security teams.
Mm-hmm.
But even then, we're still at a loss of people. I mean, looking at ISC squared number, we're still short more than 4 million folks. Do you think the board is aware of this shortage, or what it actually means to them?
Um, yes, I think they're aware of it. Unfortunately, there's no great solution to that, other than I think organizations would be primed to pay attention to the resources that they have internally already. So start taking a look at those business analysts that are really good in Excel. They might be good security people. Start taking a look at those project managers that can go through a digital transformation initiative. They could probably be put in place in the SOC in terms of doing, security initiatives within the organization. And Randy, security service providers, are doing a better job at that as well. They're doing better in terms of adding, artificial intelligence into the tier one sort of jobs that occur, so that we can automate some of these response activities. So those tier one people can now be elevated up to tier two and start doing some of those deeper level investigations that need to occur.
Well, I think that's a good point to bring up, is who's actually doing that blocking and tackling.
Mm.
Right? Because we do need these resources to focus on things that are maybe a little bit more crucial to the organization, and maybe a little bit more require a little more hands-on, a little bit more knowledge about the organization. But for things like alerts that come in, we often see customers go from implementation to implementation, never get the product actually operationalized. So once those alerts do start coming in, who's working on it? And in our own survey, Critical Start sponsoring with IDC, we asked what percent of the alerts that your team receives are being ignored or not investigated. And across the board, regardless of company size, it's over 20%. And what that 20% actually represents is accepted risk.
Yeah. And it's not only accepted risk, maybe it's forced accepted risk, because there's not enough bodies in the SOCs to be able to properly investigate it, or maybe the tooling is poor, the processes are poor to where they can't sift through properly to analyze the most critical alerts. But heck, as you and I both know, it's those low level alerts that we don't think are very important that can bite you in the 6 months later, after someone's been sniffing around your network, and all of a sudden you find that 80% of your infrastructure is encrypted.
Yep.
And here's where you need to send the Bitcoin to get your data back. It gets ugly. That's the result of. So when you start talking about, is the board aware? Boards tend to talk to other boards. It's a closed knit group, I think. So I think they're starting to realize that, because other organizations are having to have these discussions about ransomware and what do we do when we're under attack, and why are those attacks landing. A big chunk of it is they don't have the bodies, or they don't have the right services and tools that allow them to detect and respond to alerts in a timely manner.
I think what you bring up is really important about the criticality of alerts. A lot of organizations will focus on the criticals or the highs,
Yeah.
But why are they critical and high? A lot of times it's arbitrary based on known bad behavior. But what about unknown bad behavior? I mean, for example, you look at the log4shell exploit, a 0 day. You're not going to pick up the initial attack, but somebody leveraging that 0 day is likely going to use an element of skill that will not set off basic detections, right? It's not going to generate criticals and highs. They're going to use lol bins or PowerShell and kind of move laterally through the environment and establish persistence in a way that will likely set off a lot of medium and low alerts and look like administrative behavior. And if 20% of your alerts aren't getting looked at, and there's a substantial chance that you're going to go back and find some alerts that really mattered a lot earlier on in that attack cycle.
It's a vicious cycle.
It is. So when we talk about what to do about it, I mean, there's really only two things that you can do. One is improve the technology, and the other is improve the people behind it.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the DRs, right? The XDR and the MDR. And because you just had a webinar on this exact topic, I'll let you go ahead and kick off the conversation around XDR and MDR and when to use which.
Yeah, so really, they're very much related. At a super high level, what's XDR? And I think it's important to differentiate it because different firms call things that are the same different. So XDR is a platform that allows you to ingest from extended, hence the X, telemetry, whether that's endpoint, and we know how important endpoint is in terms of XDR or MDR, but also other complementary technology or telemetry such as cloud, network, edge, OT, IoT, IIoT, all that sort of telemetry is important. XDR allows you to ingest all that telemetry, ingest it into a data lake or some other sort of repository where you can sift through, use your machine learning algorithms to detect alerts. And then it gives you orchestrated responses, automated responses that allow you to do on a predetermined basis how you're going to handle specific intrusions or alerts. MDR at a super high level is essentially taking either an XDR platform or a mixture of a client's existing tools and technologies to do the exact same thing that XDR does. The key difference is that MDR wraps around a managed service wrapper around those detection and response capabilities in a 24/7 manner. Why is that important? Well, a lot of organizations operate on a 8 to 5, 9 to 5 basis, right? But the cyber criminal operates 24/7. In fact, if you think about it, if you're in the US, odds are the day shift that you're working on is when you're at night. It's a day shift for the cyber criminal in Russia or China or Iran or you name any one of those countries. So they're working when you're asleep. Well, is your security team looking for alerts? Are they monitoring the IDS systems or other systems for any alerts that need to be paid attention to? If you have that 24/7 capability, if staffing isn't an issue, then XDR is a great solution. You can take that XDR platform and then you apply the services that an MDR service would apply. So you need the 24/7 monitoring, the 24/7 detection. The other thing that I would pay attention to is MDR services typically also include threat hunting. And when we talk about threat hunting, we're talking about not only the reactive threat hunting, where they say, okay, I see something in company A, an alert that's come across, an attack that's come across. No, I'm going to look for the exact same thing in the hopefully hundreds or thousands of other companies that I work with. It's like that extra set of eyes, right? If something bad's occurring in left field, let's look at right field, center field, and behind home plate for the same sort of activity. And then there's the proactive threat hunting, and that's a hard thing to do because you not only have to have competency in being able to sift through alerts that may need more attention that were initially ignored, or you need to be able to look at current activity. Maybe it's around your crown jewels, taking a look at things that you really need to pay a whole lot of attention to. Hence the need, like we talked about before, Randy, about having that business mindset. If your SOC and your security team is in building A and the rest of your organization is in building B, or all working from home, and you're not having those discussions about what's going on in the business, where are those crown jewels located, what's going on in terms of the activity. When you're doing that proactive threat hunting, you may miss it. You may be looking at something that's not nearly as important as that distribution warehouse system that's so important to be up and running because you need to be able to ship goods to your customers.
Let's talk about kind of XDR for a second, because it does come up with XDR and MDR is an either or. And from our perspective, it certainly isn't. I mean, taking your definition of XDR a little bit further, or actually kind of simplifying it a little bit, XDR is merely the technology. MDR is
Yep.
just the service.
Yep.
So when you think of XDR, I mean, you and I kind of differ in our definition of XDR. I like to place much more emphasis on the endpoint orientation. Otherwise, it just sounds like we're describing SIM all over again.
Mm-hmm.
But there are MDRs, including Critical Start, that support industry-leading XDR platforms like Palo Alto Networks, Cortex
Mm-hmm.
XDR, Microsoft, with their Azure Sentinel XDR platform, and hopefully coming soon out of CrowdStrike and SentinelOne, a true robust XDR platform. I think the benefits of that XDR platform will allow smaller security teams to do more. But to your point, it still doesn't transform them into a 24/7 security operations center. And the
Yeah.
other thing that we're seeing out of customers that are attempting to adopt XDR and maybe short-staffed is they'll get one or two folks trained up on that XDR, and those one or two folks are now worth $100,000 more per year than they were before they were trained on that XDR platform.
Yeah.
And then it becomes a game to attract and retain talent. So really the risk that we're mitigating as an MDR service isn't just the ability to respond to attacks 24/7 and reduce dwell time, but it's also the expertise in mitigating the risk of the one person knowing how to leverage your security infrastructure, mitigating the risk of them leaving, and then you kind of just have a bunch of shelfware, right? We really
Yeah.
are the experts, and we're responsible for maintaining that working knowledge of every product inside of our SOC.
Yeah. And you can't minimize enough also the false positives. That teams that are trying to manage XDR on their own come across. That becomes so frustrating, because you just kind of feel like you're wasting your time, and that's kind of the advantage. That's one of the advantages of MDR is, it's on the MDR provider to sift through and get rid of those false positives. So if and when you need to, either co-manage or aid in an alert that comes across, that it's for real.
Yep.
So you want to make sure that your MDR provider is not sending you a bunch of false positives to go chase after, because that's their job. They have that frustration, and then, it's your job, Randy, to keep your team happy.
Yes.
You're the one.
It becomes our problem, right? And
Yeah.
Critical Start, we don't have to worry about employee retention. 98% retention in our SOC for the last 6 years. So we've lost
You're 98%.
98%.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's I'm not blowing smoke up here, but that's really pretty cool.
It is our favorite statistic. We take tremendous amount of pride in our SOC and the expertise we've built up in there, and we also put in a sizable effort to retain those analysts. We don't want them going anywhere else. We love our analyst team here, so we definitely do like to brag on them quite a bit. But in terms of XDR, I think, or MDR, sorry, I think the market trends are starting to establish themselves. Of customers recognize they don't have the ability to provide the outcomes themselves that they want, so they are looking for providers to give them these outcomes, right? Palo Alto, SentinelOne, CrowdStrike, Microsoft, all these guys give you the tools to build the outcomes, but if you don't have the people, then you're never going to get there. So I think that's being realized across the industry and kind of backed by numbers. If we look at some recent survey data that came back from another IDC survey, it was only like 12% that plan to decrease their managed service spending. Right. The entire rest of the market is like, nope, we need more help. So, and you got 80% of folks saying they're increasing their spending. That's a pretty sizable jump.
Yeah. There's definitely growth. We're in a good industry because the dollars keep coming. I think what people need to start paying attention to is being able to justify to the board and to the C-suite the efficacy of the controls that they're doing. If you're continuing to see relatively strong growth in your security program, yet you go back to those statistics in terms of number of breaches times the cost of a breach is in the six figures annually. The shelf life of a CISO is already pretty short. Generally 18 to 24 months. It doesn't get better when you're not working with the right people to make sure that you're keeping your environment secure. So while increases are good, let's make sure we're spending that money wisely. And then let's make sure we are repurposing those people to do those things that it's hard for an MDR provider to do on their own. So let's make sure that they're going off and taking a look at the DevSecOps processes. Let's take a look at the open source libraries and keep track of that stuff, because every firm is what did you say before, Randy? Every firm is now
they're all application developers.
Exactly.
Everybody's all app developers. Yep. I could not agree more with justifying the cost expenditures, right? We put a tremendous amount of effort in proving the value that we're adding to customers, because MDR is not a small spend, right? I mean, the increase of 20% or more, that is not necessarily just net new MDR customers. I mean, MDR is a growing segment, and for good reason, because we're trying to make more efficient use of the limited resources that are available to the market in general, right? And still get the same outcome. Yeah. So when we talk to customers, a lot of times they're saying, well, how do I evaluate multiple MDR providers? And for me, one of the biggest things is ask how they prove value, because you're going to have to carry that up to your board as well. If you're giving recommendations on picking a managed detection and response provider, what are some of the things you would look for?
Oh gosh, industry knowledge I think is really important. I'd be taking a look at that. Do they speak my lingo? And I would, this kind of ties back to one of your strengths that I just got excited about. What is the average tenure of your SOC team? Is it measured in months or years?
Yeah.
Which is sad to say. And then, how transparent are they? Are you able to utilize the same tools, dashboards and other things to look at alerts as what their team, as what the MDR team utilizes behind that wall? I think those are kind of three big questions that I would be taking a look at. And then, maybe a fourth one is, how well are they prepared to be able to provide that full-blown incident response capability, when that 0-day attack becomes really bad. Those are probably my top four things that I'd be looking at.
Yeah, the incident response piece is definitely becoming more and more common across MDR providers. I know we have a full-blown IR team, actual boots on ground forensics, and we're starting to see that become more and more of an MDR expectation. And rightfully so. I mean, one of the key things that we tell all of our customers when they ask what improvements they can make: when was the last time you ran an incident response tabletop? Right? Make sure those procedures are still in place. Make sure they're still relevant. Are all the contacts updated, or do you have your lawyer's phone number from 10 years ago and they no longer answer that line?
Yeah, if I ever write a book, it would probably be Tabletops for Dummies. Because I'm such a fan of that. Because again, we've talked about how important it is to have the business acumen along with the technical acumen in cybersecurity nowadays. Tabletops are those opportunities for you to, talk to your crisis communications team, or talk to your logistics people, talk to your HR team. Like I mentioned with my sister, are your doctors, how would they handle a situation where they couldn't clock in? Would that keep the operating room doors closed? Or how secure are your hospital devices that you utilize? We could go on.
Yep. Yeah, and you can pull in third parties for that as well. So if there are customers on the line that are listening and just don't know where to start with tabletops, Critical Start's happy to help. There's also services from a variety of our other security partners as well. So if you don't know how to get started on tabletops and incident response procedure development, do reach out to myself or Craig at IDC. We're happy to point you at some good resources. Well, great. That was a awesome coverage on the digital transformation and how to kind of protect against that, leveraging new products as well as some managed services. So what's next? What are some of the things that you're looking at for 2022 and beyond?
Yeah. It's almost like I still think 2022 is going to be the year of ransomware.
Yeah.
I still think that that's going to be the paramount news, but I'm going to go back to what's old is new again. And no, I'm not talking about grabbing my polyester from the 70s, for any disco dancing here or anything. But I think the insider threat is going to become more and more important. And really kind of a review of the controls that you have in house. I worked with a firm once where their IT people were logging in to their day-to-day jobs as domain admins, not just of their machine, which is so often the case today in this work from home situation, but of the enterprise. No issue if their credentials get, hacked anywhere, right, Randy? So I think just some of those back to the basic, insider control reviews is going to be important. Insider threats going to be important. I think that's more of a 2023 and beyond. I still think ransomware is going to be the thing that everyone's going to have to pay attention to. And then lastly, I would probably, I think we've talked about a little bit before, just having that cyber resilient mindset. Do you have something as basic as a cyber recovery capability? It's different recovering from a cyber incident than it is from a natural disaster. I think that'll be more important. And then the efficacy of your controls. How well is my service provider doing? Am I getting bang for the buck? Because, no offense, Randy, but you guys aren't cheap.
Nope.
But there's value. So I think being able to prove that not only the value of the service providers that these organizations are consuming, but of their own internal team, do that ROI evaluation. Are you spending money in the right ways? I don't think we need to spend less money necessarily, but where we're spending dollars today, is it being placed in the right areas?
Yep. I 100% agree. I definitely think 2022 is still ransomware year, although knock on wood, what we're seeing from attacks that we're viewing in the field, a lot more ransomware starting off interactive, where the attacker is actually interactively moving laterally, gaining footprint, and then they kind of deploy ransomware all at once. And that actually does give our service time to kind of scope and contain the breach before the ransomware is actually deployed. So as bad as ransomware is getting, at least it's not 100% automated for the most part anymore. It gives us a little bit of a chance to maybe contain the threat. But back to the basics, proving value, justifying cost, I 100% agree on that. So definitely thanks again for hanging out. It was a fun conversation. I always enjoy these talks. And appreciate the time.
No problem. It's been a good use of my time. Thanks everyone for listening. Thanks, Randy, for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks everybody. And if you want to learn more and read the paper that we've been referencing in cybersecurity, every alert matters, you can check it out on Critical Start's site, check it out on IDC's site, check out our blog, follow us on the socials. I do have a podcast that we release episodes occasionally on, so tune into that for more, and we'll talk to you all soon. Thanks again for tuning in. Bye-bye.